There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. It lives inside the chest, just below the sternum, and it does not leave after a good night's rest or a strong cup of coffee. It stays. It settles in like water seeping into the foundation of an old house, slowly, quietly, until one morning you press your hand against the wall and the whole structure trembles beneath your palm. Clara Merritt had known that kind of exhaustion for 3 years. She had learned its weight, its texture, the way it changed color depending on the hour of the day. In the mornings, it was gray. By evening, it had turned the deep, dull amber of a light bulb on the verge of burning out. She lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building on Turnpike Road in Millhaven, a town in central Ohio that had never quite decided what it wanted to be. There were stretches of it that looked almost prosperous, a hardware store with a fresh coat of paint, a diner that still did good business on Sunday mornings, a park with a functioning fountain that children loved in the summer. But there were other stretches, the ones Clara knew best, where the gutters rusted and the porches sagged and the mailboxes leaned at tired angles, as though the weight of years had finally bent them toward the earth. Turnpike Road was one of those stretches. The building where she lived was a 3-story brick structure that had long ago stopped trying to impress anyone. The hallway carpet was the color of old mustard, and the light on the 2nd floor flickered in a way that made you feel slightly nauseous if you lingered beneath it too long. The landlord, a man named Gerald Pruitt, communicated exclusively through paper notes, slipped under doors, and through the kind of pointed silence that carried more meaning than words ever could. Clara's apartment was small, and she had made it as warm as smallness allowed. The living room doubled as a homework space, a reading nook, and on nights when insomnia refused to let her go, a place to sit and listen to the building creak and settle while the rest of the world slept. She had hung 3 photographs on the wall above the couch, one of her mother taken at a county fair in 1987, one of her daughter Lily at age 4, standing in a pumpkin patch with her arms stretched wide, and one of her son Noah, taken the Christmas before last, his face split open with a joy so complete it looked almost painful. These 3 photographs were the anchors of her mornings. She looked at them before she did anything else. Before coffee, before the news, before opening whatever envelope Gerald Pruitt had slipped beneath her door in the night. Lily was 8 years old and had her father's eyes and Clara's stubbornness, a combination that sometimes made bedtime negotiations feel like international diplomacy. Noah was 5. He was small for his age and afraid of thunderstorms, and had a way of climbing into Clara's lap at the exact moment when she needed it most, as though he possessed some quiet radar for his mother's heartbreak. So Clara loved them in the way that parents love children who have cost them everything and given them more in return than anything money could measure. She loved them in the way that also sometimes kept her awake at 2 a.m., doing the math on the back of a gas station receipt, calculating how much longer the checking account would hold. The divorce had come through 18 months ago, and though the lawyers had tried to make it as clean and simple as these things could be made, there was nothing clean or simple about the aftermath. Her ex-husband, Marcus, had moved to Columbus with the kind of lightness that Clara privately resented and publicly refused to acknowledge. He paid his child support. He showed up for his weekends. He was not a bad man. He was simply a man who had found that he could breathe better somewhere else. And Clara was left to carry the particular weight of a life that had been built for 2 and was now being carried by 1. She did not speak of this. She was not the kind of woman who sat with her grief in public. She tucked it away in the same drawer where she kept the lease agreement and the overdue utility notices and the stack of coupons she always meant to organize, but never did. She worked 2 jobs. During the school week, she was a cafeteria aide at Millhaven Elementary, ladling soup and slicing pizza and counting chicken nuggets into trays with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had long since made peace with monotony. The children did not particularly see her. She was part of the furniture of their days, a smiling woman in a hairnet who handed them their lunches, and that was all right. Clara did not need to be seen at work. She needed the paycheck. 3 evenings a week, she cleaned offices for a commercial cleaning company, pushing a cart through corridors that smelled of copier, toner, and manufactured air, emptying waste baskets, wiping down counters, replacing paper towels. She did this in the hours after her sister Denise picked up the children and put them to bed at her house 2 streets over. And Clara drove home on those nights with the windows down, even in winter, because the cold air kept her awake, and she still had 45 minutes of paperwork to do before she could allow herself to sleep. It was on a Tuesday evening in late February, while she sat at the kitchen table with her second-hand laptop open to the county records website, that she first saw the listing. She had been doing what she did some evenings, scrolling through the county tax auction database out of a habit she could not entirely explain, a mixture of restless hope and the kind of curiosity that comes when you have nothing left to lose and therefore nothing to fear from looking. She had never bought anything at auction. She had no money to buy anything at auction. But she looked the way people stare into shop windows at things they cannot afford, not out of want alone, but because looking was free. The listing for 412 Dunore Lane sat at the very bottom of the page in a column of otherwise unremarkable properties. Single parcels of land, lots with no structures, a commercial warehouse with a condemned roof, the usual catalog of things that time and debt had finally claimed. And then, at the bottom, in the plain digital text of a county database record, 1 residential structure, Victorian-era construction, approximately 4,200 square feet, 4 bedrooms, 3 floors, including basement level. Condition: condemned. Reason for condemnation: chronic structural compromise due to sustained flooding of basement level. Estimated water depth: basement, 5 to 6 feet. Estimated remediation cost exceeds assessed property value. Outstanding back taxes: $9.47. Minimum bid: $10. No buyer protections. Sold as is. Clara stared at that listing for a long time without moving. The fan on her laptop hummed. The refrigerator clicked and settled. Outside, a car passed on Turnpike Road, and its headlights swept briefly across the kitchen wall like a lantern being carried through a corridor. She reached for her coffee, found it cold, and drank it anyway. She read the listing again, then a 3rd time, paying particular attention to the address and to the phrase Victorian-era construction. 4 bedrooms, 3 floors. She was not a person who made impulsive decisions. Her life had been structured entirely around the absence of impulsive decisions, around the careful calculation of every dollar and every risk, around the constant management of a present that offered very little margin for error. And yet, something in that listing caught inside her like a hook finding purchase. She typed the address into the search bar of a mapping application and waited. The satellite image loaded slowly, assembling itself in pieces, and then there it was. 412 Dunore Lane. She pressed both hands flat on the table and leaned toward the screen. It was enormous. Even from a satellite image, from even through the blurring resolution of an aerial photograph, the house was enormous. It stood on a lot at the edge of town, where Millhoven dissolved into open fields and second-growth timber, surrounded by a perimeter of tall trees that had grown wild and unkept for what appeared to be decades. The structure itself was Victorian in the fullest sense of the word, a towering, asymmetrical thing with a steeply pitched roof and what looked like a widow's walk running along the topmost level. The exterior, even from above, was visibly deteriorated, but it was vast, and it was real, and it had sold for nothing because it sat atop a flooded basement that everyone had decided was the end of the story. Clara Merritt looked at that house until the clock on the microwave read 11:47. Then she closed the laptop, washed her coffee cup, turned off the kitchen light, and stood in the darkness of her apartment, listening to the building breathe around her. She thought about the eviction notice Gerald Pruitt had slipped under her door 2 weeks ago. She thought about Noah asking her last Thursday whether they would have to move again. She thought about Lily's school project, a family history timeline that Lily had filled in with what she knew and left blank where she did not, and the blank spaces had stretched back further than the filled ones. Then she opened the laptop again. She found the auction registration form. She entered her information. She submitted the form. She closed the laptop again and went to bed and lay in the dark with her eyes wide open and her heart beating in a way that felt less like fear than like something she had not felt in a very long time. She did not tell anyone about the listing until after she had driven past the property on a Saturday morning, with both children buckled in the back seat of her 12-year-old Civic and a thermos of coffee in the cup holder. She turned onto Dunore Lane and drove slowly. The road narrowed as it moved away from the main stretch of town, the asphalt growing pocked and uneven, the tree canopy thickening overhead until the morning light arrived in pieces rather than all at once. And then she saw it in person for the first time, and she stopped the car in the middle of the road because there was no other traffic, and she needed a moment to simply look. The house at 412 Dunore Lane was, without question, the most beaten and battered thing she had ever seen that had also once been beautiful. It rose above the surrounding tree line in a way that seemed to defy the humility of its current condition. 3 stories of Victorian architecture with a 4th partial level beneath it that she could not see but knew was down there, buried in dark water. The exterior paint had been white once, possibly, but it bleached and peeled through decades of exposure into a surface that looked more like weathered bone. Several of the upper windows were broken, their frames dark and gaping. The roof sagged at the southwestern corner in a concave depression that looked exhausted rather than collapsed. The front porch ran the full width of the house and had once been grand in the way that front porches in old houses were grand, wide enough for rocking chairs and summer conversations, and the particular leisure of a different era. Now it listed slightly to one side, its railings missing in sections, the boards darkened with moisture and time. The yard was a wilderness. 30 years of untended growth had filled it with brambles and wild sumac, and the kind of grass that grows in thick, aggressive clumps rather than in the polite rows of maintained lawns. Several large oaks stood around the perimeter of the lot, their roots pushing up through the soil in arching knuckles. And along the south side of the foundation, barely visible through the overgrowth, Clara could see the dark stains that water leaves on stone when it has been sitting against a surface for decades, a permanent watermark etched into the masonry like a tide line on a sea wall. In the back seat, Lily pressed her nose against the window. "What is that?" she asked. Clara said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I think it's ours." Noah said, "It's scary." Clara said, "I know. Sometimes things are scary before they're beautiful." She did not entirely believe that. Not yet. But she said it anyway. That afternoon, she called her sister Denise. This was a mistake in the way that most honest conversations between sisters are mistakes, useful and painful in equal measure. Denise was 3 years older than Clara, practical in the way that oldest children in struggling families often become practical, calibrated to the frequency of hard reality. She had a good job, a solid house, a husband named Phil, who fixed things around the house without being asked. Denise was one of the people Clara admired most in the world, and one of the people she found most difficult to tell things to, precisely because Denise's care came packaged with an unflinching clarity that did not always leave room for hope. Clara explained the auction. She explained the listing, the flooding, the condemned status, the price. She said she was thinking of bidding. There was a silence on the other end of the phone that lasted approximately 4 seconds and contained more information than most conversations. Then Denise said, "Clara, you have $10. "I know," Clara said. "You barely have rent," Denise said. "You're behind on the electric. You just told me last month you were looking at whether the kids could qualify for the subsidized lunch program. I know all of that." "Then what are you thinking?" Denise's voice was not unkind. That was the hardest part. It was entirely kind, which meant it was entirely honest, which meant it was harder to push away. You're thinking about putting your last $10 into a flooded, condemned building. Because why? Because it used to be pretty? Clara, the county won't let you live in a condemned property. You'd have to remediate the flooding, repair the structure, get it re-inspected. That costs money. A lot of money. More money than you have. "I know," Clara said again. "Then I don't understand what you're telling me." "I'm not sure I'm telling you anything yet," Clara said. "I think I'm just saying it out loud to hear what it sounds like." Denise exhaled. "It sounds like someone drowning reaching for a rope that isn't there." Clara looked at the satellite image still open on her laptop. "Maybe," she said. "But at least I'm still reaching." She told Marcus when he picked up the children the following Saturday. She did not tell him with any expectation of support. She told him the way you tell a person about a dream you had, not because you think it will become real, but because you need to put it somewhere outside of yourself. Marcus listened from the driver's seat of his car with the patient, slightly pained expression of a man who has learned the hard way that arguing with Clara Merritt about her convictions is like arguing with weather. He said he thought it sounded risky. He said he worried about the kids getting attached to a property that would probably never be habitable. He said he hoped she knew what she was doing. Clara said she appreciated the concern and handed Noah his overnight bag and kissed both children and watched the car pull away from the curb. She found out about the previous owner through the county records office on a Thursday afternoon when she called during her lunch break and asked a woman named Patricia to read her what was on file. Patricia was methodical and thorough and had clearly been doing this for many years. The property, Patricia explained, had belonged to a man named Edmund Hargrove. He had purchased it in 1951 and had lived in it alone for 38 years until his death in 1989. He had no recorded spouse, no children, no immediate next of kin that the county had been able to locate. His estate had defaulted to the county for lack of a will and a named executor. Back taxes had accumulated. Legal proceedings had been ongoing in the slow, grinding way that proceedings involving unclaimed estates and governmental bureaucracy tend to be ongoing, stretching across years that turned into decades. The flooding of the basement had occurred sometime in the early 1990s, attributed in the records to the failure of an old drainage system, combined with what a county inspector had described at the time as a significant underground water source of unclear origin. The basement had remained flooded since then. The house had sat untouched. Clara wrote down Edmund Hargrove's name on the back of an envelope and stared at it after she hung up the phone. 38 years alone in that house. She tried to imagine it. A man in 4,000 square feet of Victorian silence, living among whatever he had accumulated and whatever he had chosen to keep. She tried to imagine him in the rooms she had not yet walked through, and found the image would not quite form. Well, he was a ghost in the structure she intended to enter, and she felt a strange obligation toward him, a courtesy, a need to understand what she was walking into before she walked into it. She found a single mention of him in the digitized archives of the Millhaven Gazette. A small notice from 1967 about a donation he had made to the County Historical Society, described only as a significant contribution to the Society's preservation efforts. The notice referred to him as a private collector and noted that he had declined to be photographed or interviewed. There was no follow-up, no other mentions. Edmund Hargrove had lived and died in Millhaven like a stone dropped into still water, making almost no ripple at the surface. The auction was held on the first Friday of March at the County Administrative Building, some single-story structure near the center of town that smelled of carpet cleaner and institutional coffee. Clara arrived 10 minutes early, wearing a navy blazer she kept for occasions that required a version of herself that looked more certain than she felt. She carried a folder with a copy of the property listing, her identification, and the county's required deposit form. The deposit was nominal, barely anything, and she had transferred it from her account that morning with the particular care of someone handling a very delicate object. There were 11 other bidders registered for the session, most of them there for the commercial warehouse, for the vacant lots, for the kinds of properties that had some discernible calculation attached to them. The Hargrove property was not mentioned until near the end of the list, after the other parcels had been dispensed with. By that point, the room had thinned somewhat. Several people had already left. Clara sat in her folding chair with her hands in her lap and waited. When the auctioneer reached the listing for 412 Dunore Lane, there was a brief, particular silence in the room, the kind that forms around something that everyone has already collectively dismissed. The auctioneer read the description in a flat voice. Condemned. Flooded. Sold as is. Minimum bid, $10. He looked up. Any openers? Clara raised her hand. $10, she said. No one else moved. The auctioneer looked around the room with the patient expression of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by the arithmetic of other people's decisions. Hearing $10, he said. Going once. Going twice. From the row behind her, a man in a green canvas jacket said something to the man beside him in a voice that was not quite a whisper. She heard the word flooded. She heard what might have been the word crazy. She did not turn around. Sold, the auctioneer said. Clara drove to Dunore Lane directly after signing the paperwork. She sat in her car at the end of the driveway and looked at the house for a long time without getting out. The sky was low and gray, the kind of March sky that can't decide whether it wants to rain or simply threaten. Wind moved through the bare branches of the oaks and made a sound that Clara had always associated with loneliness. Not the kind of loneliness that comes from being alone, but the deeper, older kind that belongs to places that have been waiting for something without knowing what. She felt it pressing against the windows of the car, that waiting, and she said to herself quietly, in a voice that was barely above a breath, "I'm here now." She got out of the car. She walked to the front porch. The boards held her weight, though they complained about it. She used the key the county clerk had given her to unlock the front door and pushed it open. The smell reached her first. Old wood and damp stone, and the particular mustiness of a space that has been sealed for a very long time. Layers of decades compressed into an olfactory record of everything the house had held and everything it had slowly lost. She stood in the front hallway and let her eyes adjust. Light came in through the windows in dusty shafts, catching the particles that her entry had disturbed and making them drift and spiral in the gray air. The foyer was wide, wider than she had expected, floored in black and white hexagonal tile that had cracked in places, but held its pattern in others with surprising dignity. A staircase rose directly ahead of her, broad and sweeping, its banister still intact. The dark wood of it carved in the elaborate fashion of a century ago. Scrollwork and newel posts, and a handrail that curved at the bottom with a grace that the rest of the house's deterioration had not yet managed to entirely erase. She did not go to the basement that first day. She walked every room of the upper floors with deliberate slowness, noting what was there and what was missing, cataloging the structure the way a doctor catalogs a patient, searching for the damage and for the vitality that persisted despite it. The first floor held a parlor, a dining room, and a large kitchen at the back that had been modernized at some point in the 1970s and then abandoned before the modernization could be completed. The second floor held 3 large bedrooms and a sitting room. The third floor held a 4th bedroom and what appeared to have once been a study, its walls lined floor to ceiling with built-in bookshelves that were empty now, but for the residue of decades of neglect. The widow's walk was accessible through a door from the study, and she opened it and stepped outside and stood in the wind above the tree line and looked at Millhaven spread below her, small and ordinary and entirely unaware of what she was doing up here on the highest point on this end of town. The basement door was at the end of the ground floor hallway, a heavy wooden door with a round brass knob that was green with oxidation. She stood before it and held the knob and didn't turn it for a long moment. She could feel the cold radiating through the wood, a deeper cold than the rest of the house, weighted and still. She could smell it too, that low mineral smell of standing water, the particular scent that dark, wet places hold, not unpleasant exactly, but ancient, primordial, like the smell of a cave or the inside of a well. She pressed her ear against the door and listened. Silence, a kind of absolute silence that felt inhabited rather than empty. She opened the door. The staircase descended into darkness, and 4 steps down the light from the hallway fell away, and the darkness became complete. She used her phone's flashlight to continue. The beam caught the stair treads, old wood swollen with moisture. The paint on the walls of the stairwell long ago surrendered to the damp, and now reduced to bare plaster stained in irregular patterns of gray and brown. She descended 5 steps, 6, 7, and then her flashlight beam swept forward and she stopped. The water surface was there, 6 steps below where she stood, black and absolutely still, reflecting the thin beam of her light back at her like a mirror. It extended outward from the base of the stairs in every direction, filling the basement completely as far as she could see, reaching the stone foundation walls on all sides and disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of her phone's light. The ceiling was low, barely 7 feet above the water, the beams running across it draped with the slow biology of long-standing damp. The silence down here was different from the silence upstairs. It was heavier. It pressed against her eardrums. It felt as though the water itself were holding its breath. She stood there for a long time on the 7th step, with her phone raised, and her light sweeping slowly left and right across the surface of the water. She was measuring, estimating. The basement beneath this house was the basement of a Victorian structure, which meant it was not the cramped utility space of a modern home. It would be large. She knew that from the footprint of the house above, possibly spanning the full ground floor above it, or close to it, running perhaps 50 feet by 40 feet, perhaps more. And it was filled to a depth of what her phone's light suggested was somewhere between 5 and 6 feet of standing water, say water that had been here for 30 years, that had closed over whatever the basement contained and sealed it in a kind of involuntary preservation, a time capsule of darkness and cold. She climbed back up the stairs and closed the basement door behind her. She stood in the hallway with her hand still on the knob and breathed. A single thought formed, not dramatic, not triumphant, just practical and quiet the way her thoughts usually were when they mattered most. She thought, I need a pump. She spent the next 2 weeks making preparations. She researched electric submersible sump pumps and their rates of displacement. She learned that the better models could move approximately 30 gallons per minute, which meant roughly 1,800 gallons per hour. And she estimated the basement contained somewhere between 60 and 90,000 gallons of water. This meant a single good pump could drain the basement in 33 to 50 hours of continuous operation, approximately 2 to 3 days of running a single pump, or half that with 2. She called 3 rental equipment companies before finding one in a town 20 miles away that had the model she needed at a rate she could manage if she stretched her next paycheck and borrowed $200 from Denise, a conversation she dreaded for reasons that had nothing to do with the money. She borrowed the money from Denise on a Sunday afternoon while the children were in the backyard. Denise handed over the cash with the expression of a person fulfilling an obligation they had already accepted, while reserving the right to say, I told you so later. She said, you know the county isn't going to let you live there until that structure's passed inspection. She said, you know remediation alone could cost thousands, even after the water's out. She said, Clara, I love you, and I'm going to keep helping you, but I need you to understand that buying this house doesn't actually fix anything. Not for you. Not for the kids. I know, Clara said. Then what are you hoping for? Denise asked. Clara folded the cash and slid it into the pocket of her jeans. She thought about the listing on the county website. She thought about Edmund Hargrove, a private collector who had lived alone in a 4,000-square-foot house for 38 years and left no will and no photograph and apparently no trace of himself that anyone had ever thought worth noting. She thought about the basement door and the black water and the absolute stillness of the air down there, the quality of that silence, the way it had felt not empty but full. "I don't know exactly," she said honestly, "but I feel like the house is trying to tell me something, and I'm the first person in 30 years who's been willing to listen." Denise looked at her for a long moment, with an expression Clara had seen on her sister's face before, when they were children, and their mother had made some improbable decision that turned out, eventually, to be right. It was an expression that lived exactly at the border of doubt and love. She said nothing else about it that afternoon. Clara rented the pump the following Thursday, loading it into the trunk of her Civic with the help of the rental place's young employee, who asked what she was pumping out and seemed genuinely startled when she said a basement. When she said it had been flooded for 30 years, he stared at her. "What's down there?" he asked. Clara said, "That's what I'm trying to find out." Getting the pump into the basement required removing the door from its hinges and maneuvering the unit down the swollen staircase in a process that took an hour and a half and left her with a bruised forearm and a level of physical exhaustion that made her feel briefly proud. She fed the discharge hose through the ground floor hallway and out through the front door, running it across the porch and down the steps and out into the wild yard, where it would spill its contents into the drainage ditch along the property's north edge. She lowered the pump into the water on the end of the intake line, standing on the bottom step and reaching down until she felt the cold of the water close over her wrist. The pump descended. She heard it touch bottom. She ran the extension cord back to the portable generator she had rented along with it, because the house had no live electricity. And when she pulled the generator's cord and felt it cough and rumble and catch, and when she flipped the switch on the pump and heard the motor engage, and the discharge hose stiffen and shudder with the first rush of water moving through it, she sat down on the 5th step of the basement staircase with her elbows on her knees and her hands clasped, and she breathed out a long, shaking breath that had been building in her chest for weeks. The pump ran. The water began to go. It was slow at first, or it seemed slow, because she was watching too closely. She checked the water level against a mark she had made on the stone foundation wall with a piece of chalk, and for the first 2 hours the water line barely moved. She made herself go upstairs. She made herself walk the rooms. She ate the sandwich she had brought and drank the coffee from her thermos and stood at the kitchen window and watched the gray sky above the tree line and told herself to be patient. Patience was something she had been practicing for 3 years. She was getting better at it, for though it still cost her something every time. By late afternoon, the water line had dropped 4 inches below her chalk mark. She went down the stairs and crouched at the water line and pressed her palm to the stone wall and felt the cold radiating from it, the deep cold of stone that has been in contact with water for a long time. Beneath the water's surface, she could see nothing. The beam of her flashlight died in the dark opacity of the water, less than a foot below the surface. Whatever was down here was still hidden, still sealed in 30 years of black water and silence, still waiting. She drove home in the early evening with the generator running behind the locked door and the pump still working, pulling the water up and out, gallon by slow gallon. She fed the children and helped Lily with a reading assignment and sat with Noah through the first 20 minutes of his bath because he didn't like being alone in bathrooms after dark. She checked the weather and found no rain forecast for the next 4 days. She washed the dishes and wiped down the table and turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark apartment, listening to the building settle around her, the same way she did most nights. But tonight, the feeling was different. Tonight, the waiting had a direction. Tonight, there was somewhere it was pointed. Her phone buzzed. A text from Denise. "How's the pump?" Clara typed back. "Running. Water's down 4 inches." There was a pause. Then, "You okay?" Clara looked at the 3 photographs on the wall above the couch. Her mother. Lily in the pumpkin patch. Noah on Christmas morning. She typed, "Yeah. Actually, yeah." She went to bed and slept well, which surprised her, and in the morning she drove back to Dunore Lane before the children woke and found that the water line had dropped another 14 inches overnight, and the generator was still running, and the hose was still running, and the basement was beginning, very slowly, to give itself up. She stood at the top of the basement stairs in the gray morning light and shone her phone's flashlight down into the changed darkness, and she could see more now. She could see the upper portions of what appeared to be the basement walls, stone masonry running in irregular courses, dark and stained, but solid. She could see the tops of what looked like wooden shelving units beginning to emerge from the water on the far wall, on their upper edges appearing like islands rising from a receding sea. She could see the outline of something else, further back, something that was not shelving and was not wall, something with a geometry that her brain did not immediately interpret, a shape that emerged in her peripheral light as square and deliberate and sealed. She stared at it for a long moment from the top of the stairs. The pump hummed below her. The water moved. The shape remained just out of full resolution, half submerged, patient. Clara gripped the stair rail and told herself to wait, to let the pump do its work, to let the water finish its retreat before she went down there and touched anything. She had been waiting for 3 years for some kind of reprieve, for some sign that the story of her life was not simply a story of diminishment, and of things slowly being taken away. She could wait another day. She could wait another 2 days if she had to. But she stood at the top of those stairs for a very long time. That evening she ran into Tom Belcher at the gas station on Route 9, a man she had gone to high school with, who now worked for the county planning office and had a habit of delivering information with the cheerfulness of someone who considered being right a recreational activity. He had heard about the auction. Millhaven was not a large town, and the auction had not been a secret, and Clara was not invisible in it. He said, "I heard you picked up the Hargrove place." Clara said she had. He filled his tank and looked at her with the expression of a man who is organizing his features into something that will not technically be cruel. He said, "You know that property's unsalvageable. The county assessed it twice in the 90s, and both times the engineers said the foundation was compromised by the sustained flooding. Even if you pump it out, you're probably looking at structural failure in the lower walls." He paused. "You know that, right?" "I know the county's assessment," Clara said. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "I mean, $10 is $10, but I wouldn't go spending any more on it if I were you." Clara replaced the gas cap. She looked at him. He had the comfortable confidence of someone who had never needed to consider alternatives, who had always had the option of the obviously correct choice. She said, "You're probably right." She drove away and did not think about what he had said for very long, because she had learned 3 years ago that the opinions of people who have not stood at the edge of your particular precipice are the opinions least worth carrying. The pump ran through the night again and into the next morning. By the time Clara arrived at the house on the second full day of draining, the waterline had dropped nearly 3 feet. She descended the stairs cautiously, the treads wet and slick beneath her boots, and stepped onto the basement floor for the first time. The water was at her knees here. She moved forward slowly. The floor beneath was stone, cold and uneven, covered in a thin layer of silt that had settled over 3 decades. Her boots sank slightly with each step, and the water moved sluggishly around her. The smell was intense at this level, mineral and old, but not putrid, not the smell of something rotting, more like the smell of something preserved. She swept her flashlight across the walls, and the room began to reveal itself. The basement was even larger than she had anticipated from the floor plan, stretching perhaps 60 feet in length and 40 across, divided by 2 load-bearing pillars of dressed stone that rose from the floor to the ceiling beams. The shelving units along the north wall were made of heavy timber, old growth by the look of them, and they had survived the flooding with a soundness that surprised her. They were empty. Whatever had stood on them was either gone or submerged on the lower shelves, still beneath the waterline. She turned her light toward the far end of the basement, toward the shape she had seen the night before from the top of the stairs. The shape that had geometry that was not structural, or not architectural, not the geometry of walls or beams or supports. She waded toward it. The water resisted her. Her heart was loud in her own ears. It emerged from the water as she drew closer in the way that all revealed things emerge, first as a suggestion, then as a form, then finally as a fact. It was a wall. Not the foundation wall of the house, something built within it. A secondary wall of stone and mortar constructed perpendicular to the foundation, rising from floor to ceiling at the far end of the basement, bisecting it, completely sealing what was behind it. On its surface, where the waterline had receded, she could see that the mortar was different, newer somehow, more deliberate than the rough, random coursing of the original foundation. This wall had been built inside the basement. It had been put there by someone, at some point, with intention, and it had been flooded over and sealed by the water and forgotten for 30 years. Clara stood in knee-deep water at the edge of the receding lake and looked at that wall and held very still. The pump hummed behind her. The water moved. The generator ran its steady diesel breath from somewhere upstairs. She pressed her hand flat against the face of the wall. The stone was cold beneath her palm, cold and solid and real. She said nothing. There were no words for what she felt standing there in the flooded basement of a dead man's house, with her hand against a wall that should not exist. She just stood there, and she waited for the water to go down. On the morning of the 3rd day, Clara did not go directly to the house. She stood in the kitchen of her apartment on Turnpike Road and made coffee, and stood at the window and watched the sky above the neighboring rooftop turn from the gray of early morning to the pale, flat blue of a March day that could not quite commit to anything. She poured the coffee. She drank it at the window. She was aware, in the particular way that certain moments make you aware, that something was about to change. Not in the dramatic, sweeping sense of the word, not the way change is described in movies or in the kinds of stories people tell after the fact, when they know how everything turned out. More quietly than that. More like the feeling that comes just before a lock turns, that faint mechanical tension that precedes the click, that moment of held breath between not open and open. She called her sister at 7:15. Denise picked up on the second ring, which meant she was already awake and moving, making lunches or running the dishwasher, or performing one of the dozen practical tasks that defined her mornings. "The pump's been running for nearly 60 hours, Clara said without preamble. Denise said, "And?" "I'm going back today. I think the basement might be close to clear." There was a brief silence. Then Denise said, "Do you want me to come?" Clara thought about it. She thought about the sealed wall she had seen in the knee-deep water 2 days ago, the deliberate perpendicular line of it, the different quality of its mortar, the way it had not felt like a structural element, but like a decision. She thought about the fact that she did not yet know what was behind it, and that not knowing it was the last moment she would ever have of pure, undiluted possibility. "Not yet," she said. "Let me go first." Denise paused, then said, "You'll call me." "I'll call you," Clara said. She dropped the children at Denise's house. Noah clung to her neck for 3 seconds longer than usual, which was his version of saying something he could not name. Lily said, "Are you going to the flooded house?" Clara said yes. Lily said, "Are you going to go inside the water part?" Clara said she hoped the water would mostly be gone by now. Lily said, "Mom, you should bring a flashlight." Clara said she had one. Lily considered this, and then said, "And a jacket." Clara kissed her forehead and said she had a jacket too, and drove to Dunore Lane with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. The house looked the same from the road. It always would, she supposed, at least for a while. From the outside, some 412 Dunore Lane was still a condemned Victorian structure at the edge of town, with a ruined porch and broken windows, and 30 years of untended growth pressing in from all sides. Nothing about its exterior announced that anything inside it had changed. The pump hose still ran across the porch and down the steps and out into the yard, still carrying water, still doing its slow, patient work. The generator still ran, its diesel rumble a constant low note beneath the silence of the property. She parked and walked to the front door and stood on the porch for a moment, listening to the sound of the pump, which had changed in pitch, she realized, or perhaps in quality. It was not straining the way it had in the first hours. It was working differently now, pulling against something shallower, something closer to the end. She went inside. The hallway was as she had left it. The black and white hexagonal tile, the staircase with its carved banister, the dust, and the quiet and the cold that the house held in its bones. She walked to the basement door at the end of the hall and stood before it and put her hand on the oxidized brass knob and opened it. The smell was different. Still mineral, still old, still the deep stone-cold scent of a space that had held water for a very long time. But the quality of it had changed, the way a room smells different when the source of its particular character has been diminished. The water was going. She could tell before she even began to descend. She shone her flashlight down the staircase, and the beam went further than it had ever gone before, reaching the basement floor, reaching across it, or picking out the texture of the silt-covered stone, and traveling all the way to the far wall without being swallowed by any remaining depth of water. The basement was empty, or nearly so. There were still thin sheets of water lying across the low points in the floor, shallow and dark, reflecting her flashlight in moving planes of light. The pump intake still sat in the deepest corner, still pulling the last of it up and out. But the standing water was gone. The 5 or 6 feet of it that had sealed this space since the early 90s had been lifted away and discharged into the drainage ditch outside, and what remained was the basement itself, revealed, available, real. Clara descended the stairs one step at a time, her flashlight sweeping ahead of her, and stepped onto the basement floor for the first time without waiting. Her boots left prints in the silt. The floor was cold through the soles. She turned slowly in a circle, moving the light. She had stood here 2 days ago in knee-deep water and taken in the room's dimensions, its length and its width, the timber shelving along the north wall, the stone pillars. She had mapped it imperfectly, working against the resistance of the water and the limit of her flashlight. Now she could see all of it, and it was larger than she had thought, and the shelving was more extensive, and the stone pillars were more massive, and the ceiling was lower, and the walls closer, and the whole thing had the particular intimacy of a space that has been sealed and forgotten, the intimacy of a secret room. She turned her light toward the far end. The wall was there, the secondary wall. The one that had no structural purpose and no reason to exist except intention. In the full light of the drained basement, without the distortion of water and partial submersion, it was even more unmistakable. It rose from the stone floor to the ceiling beams above, spanning the full width of the basement at the southern end, a partition of mortared fieldstone that someone had constructed with considerable care and considerable commitment to permanence. The mortar was darker in color than the foundation walls, and the stones themselves had a slightly different character, cut and fitted rather than rough set, as though someone had taken time over this project, had done it properly, had done it to last. In the center of the wall, there was a door. She had not seen it from the top of the stairs 2 days ago. She had not been able to see it from the waterline when she had waded close in 3 feet of water, because the door's lower half had still been submerged and the upper half had been in shadow. But now, with the basement emptied and her flashlight angled directly at the wall, the door was plain and obvious and completely visible. It was a wooden door, heavy by the look of it, set into a fitted stone frame with iron hinges that had rusted but held. Its surface was gray with age and damp, the wood blackened at the lower third, where it had been in contact with water for 30 years, but the upper 2/3 had the density of something that had been built to resist time. There was no knob. There was a lock, an old mortise lock set into the door's face, a heavy iron plate with a keyhole of the old-fashioned variety, not the kind that takes a long, flat key with a round bow. Clara stood in front of that door for a long moment. The pump continued its work behind her. The generator ran. The thin sheets of remaining water reflected her flashlight in shifting patterns across the ceiling. She was entirely alone in this basement, in this house, at the end of this lane, at the edge of this town. And the silence was not frightening anymore. It was expectant. It had the quality of a crowd that has been waiting quietly and has just become aware that what it was waiting for is almost here. She tried the door. Not with any key, because she had no key. Simply with her hand on the iron plate, pushing gently to gauge whether the lock held. It held. Whatever was behind this door was behind this door, because someone had put it there and locked it, and then the water had come, and the water had kept it locked for 30 years. She pushed harder. The door did not move. She ran her hand along the frame, feeling the junction between stone and wood, testing the integrity of the seal. The frame was solid. The hinges were rusted, but she could see they had not corroded through. The lock was intact. She needed a key. Or she needed someone who understood old mortise locks. Or she needed a pry bar and the willingness to damage a door that had been standing for decades and deserved some respect. She chose the third option, but she drove to the hardware store first. She bought a heavy pry bar and a set of bolt cutters on credit, adding them to a balance she would figure out later. And she bought a pair of nitrile gloves and a headlamp because she was tired of holding the flashlight and needed both hands. She drove back to Dunore Lane and went back down the stairs and stood before the door again. And this time, she put the headlamp on and clipped it to her forehead, and the beam shone white and direct onto the door's face, and she could see it clearly. She worked the flat end of the pry bar into the gap between the door frame and the door, just above the lock plate, and she leaned her weight into it. The wood resisted with the full authority of its age and density. She repositioned, applied pressure again, and this time there was a sound, a low, splintering complaint from somewhere in the door's frame, and the gap widened a fraction. She worked the bar in deeper, applied her weight again. Another sound. The iron hinges groaned. She moved the bar to the hinge side and pushed until the screws holding the lower hinge to the frame began to pull free from the aged mortar, and the door shifted. And she repositioned again and pushed with everything she had, and the door swung inward with a sound that she would spend a long time afterward trying to describe and never quite manage. The air that came out was different. That was the first thing. Even before she moved the headlamp to look, even before her eyes processed anything, the air that passed her from the opened room struck her as different. Not the mineral cold of the flooded basement, not the damp mustiness of the sealed space outside the door. The air that came from behind that door was cool and dry, almost remarkably so, and it carried a scent that she placed after a moment as wood, polished wood and paper, and a faint trace of something metallic and clean, and beneath all of it, something older still, something she had no name for, an age that was not decay. She stepped through the doorway. The room was 10 feet wide and 12 feet deep. That was all. A modest room, not grand, not theatrical, simply a room built into the southern end of the basement, behind the wall, sealed by the door. The floor was stone like the rest of the basement, but cleaner. Grit-covered, but not silted, as though the flooding had not reached in here. The walls were the field stone of the partition, bare and close. The ceiling was low. A single bare bulb on a cord hung from the center beam, long dead. And the room was full. That was the only word for it. Full. Not cluttered, not chaotic, not thrown together. It had been organized, but deliberately and carefully, by someone who understood what they were storing and intended it to last. Along the 3 walls that were not the door, surfaces had been built or placed, shelves, benches, a low wooden table in the center, and on all of them, arranged with the quiet precision of a person who did not do things carelessly, were objects. Clara turned her headlamp slowly around the room and did not speak, and did not move for a long time. On the shelving along the right wall, there were wooden crates, flat and shallow, stacked 6 high, each one sealed and labeled in a careful hand, with numbers and letters she did not immediately understand. Perhaps 20 crates in all, some larger, some the size of a carry-on bag, a few as small as a shoebox. On the shelf below the crates, there were canvas rolls, tied with twine, and perhaps a dozen of them, of varying lengths, the largest perhaps 3 feet across. On the left wall, there was a series of locked wooden boxes, smaller than the crates, their surfaces fitted with brass clasps and hinges, stacked and ordered with the same meticulous attention. On the central table, there was a leather-bound ledger, swollen slightly with age, but intact, and beside it, a wooden tray holding a set of tools she could not immediately identify. Small, precise things, the kind of tools that are made for handling objects that require precision and care. On the back wall, hanging from iron hooks that had been set into the stone at careful intervals, were frames. Paintings. Perhaps a dozen of them, all different sizes, all oriented facing outward, all covered with protective cloth that had been fitted over them and tied in place, till they hung there in their protective wrapping, patient and silent, waiting. Clara stood in the doorway of Edmund Hargrove's sealed room and understood, without being able to fully articulate what she understood, that she was looking at a life's work. Not in the metaphorical sense, in the literal sense. A man had spent decades acquiring these things, one by one or occasionally perhaps in groups, and had carried them into this basement room and arranged them here with love and deliberation, and had then sealed them behind a mortared wall and locked them behind a heavy door. Not to hide them from time, not carelessly, but because he knew that the surface world was unreliable and that what mattered deserved better than the surface world could offer. She walked to the central table and looked at the ledger without touching it. She could see through the swollen cover that it was not a personal journal. The entries visible through the cracked leather spine had a different character. Columns, numbers, dates, the formal record of a person who had documented what they owned, and when, and what they knew about it. She wanted to open it. She forced herself to wait. She was still wearing the nitrile gloves. She was still standing in a condemned building. There was a process for this. She understood that there was a process for this, even if she did not yet know exactly what the process was. She went to the paintings first because they called to her in a way she could not fully rationalize. She went to the smallest one on the far left and lifted the protective cloth from its corner, just slightly, just enough to see the surface beneath. Oil on canvas, a figure in a garden, painted in a style that was immediate and loose and alive, the kind of looseness that is not carelessness, but confidence, the kind that comes after 10,000 hours. She could not see a signature from this angle, and she did not pull the cloth further. She let it fall back. She went to the wooden crates and looked more closely at the labeling on the nearest one. The label was handwritten in the same careful script she had seen in the ledger's spine. It read, U.S. 1847 series, MS 63 or higher, double eagle, confirmed. Beneath that, 12 units, and beneath that, a date from 1974. Clara stared at the label. U.S. 1847 double eagle. She knew enough to know she did not know enough. She knew coins had value. She knew that particular designation meant something. She knew that the careful labeling on this crate, in this sealed room, behind this locked door, by a man described in county records as a private collector who had declined to be photographed or interviewed, meant that these 12 units in this crate were almost certainly not the loose change of a person who collected casually. She stood up from the crate and turned around and looked at the room again. 20 crates, perhaps a dozen canvas rolls, a row of locked wooden boxes, a dozen wrapped paintings on the back wall, and the ledger on the table. Her hands were not shaking. That surprised her. She had expected, if she was honest, a physical reaction, some spilling of the tension she had been carrying since the auction. Since the first moment she had looked at the satellite image of this house on her second-hand laptop in the kitchen of her apartment on Turnpike Road. She had expected her hands to shake, and instead they were very still. Her breathing was steady. She felt a profound and unusual quiet move through her, from the top of her head downward, the way warmth spreads through a cold body when it is finally given heat. She took out her phone. The battery was at 41%. She opened the camera and began to photograph the room, methodically, beginning at the doorway and moving clockwise. Every shelf, every crate, every canvas roll, every locked wooden box, the ledger on the table, the paintings on the back wall, still in their protective cloth, the tool tray, the iron hooks. She took 47 photographs. Then she turned and walked out of the room, back through the doorway, back through the drained basement, back up the stairs, and out through the front door of the house into the pale March air. She sat down on the top porch step because her legs had finally decided, now that there was nothing left to be strong for, that they were tired. She sat there and looked out at the wild, overgrown yard and at the bare trees and at the sky. She did not call anyone for a few minutes. She simply sat. A bird was calling from somewhere in the oaks, a repetitive two-note call, and she listened to it. The generator hummed. The pump hose trickled its last output into the drainage ditch. The world was exactly as it had been an hour ago, and exactly as ordinary as it had always been from the outside. Then she called her sister. Denise answered on the second ring again. Before she could speak, Clara said, "I need you to listen to me and not talk until I'm done." Denise was quiet. Clara said, "I found a room, a sealed room in the basement, on behind a stone wall with a locked door. I got it open. It's full of things. Wooden crates labeled with U.S. coin series from the mid-1800s, canvas rolls, wooden boxes, paintings, maybe a dozen paintings, covered but intact, and a ledger. The whole room is organized, labeled. It was put there on purpose by the previous owner, a man named Edmund Hargrove, who the county described as a private collector. He lived alone in this house for 38 years, and he died in 1989. And nobody has been in this room since the basement flooded in the early 90s. Possibly, nobody has been in this room since he put everything in it." Denise did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "Clara, I need names," Clara said. "I need to know who evaluates these things properly, who authenticates coins, who appraises art. I need someone who can tell me what I'm actually looking at." "Clara," Denise said again, and this time her voice had a quality that Clara had rarely heard in it, a kind of unsteadiness, not fear, but something adjacent to it, the sound of a person recalibrating rapidly. "How big is the room?" 10 by 12. "And it's full?" "Not wall to wall, but it's organized. Organized the way someone organizes things they care about, things they've spent a long time acquiring." Another silence. Then, "I know someone. A woman named Ruth Hadley. She teaches art history at the college in Dexter. She knows appraisers. She'd know who to call." "Call her," Clara said. "Today, if you can. And Denise, please don't tell anyone else yet." "Why?" "Because I don't know what I have," Clara said, "and I don't want anyone else deciding what I have before I do." She could hear Denise's breath on the line, the steady, careful intake and release of a woman processing something her practical mind was working very hard to accommodate. Finally, Denise said, "Okay, I'll call Ruth today." Clara hung up and sat for a moment longer on the porch step. She thought about Edmund Hargrove. She thought about a man who had filled a room and sealed it and said nothing about it to anyone, who had left no will and no executor and no instructions, who had been remembered only as a man who made a donation once and declined to have his photograph taken. She thought about what it meant to devote a life to acquiring beautiful things, and then seal them away in darkness where no one could see them. She did not feel entirely comfortable with what she thought about it. There was something in it that was both an act of love and an act of withholding. A man who had trusted nothing, no one enough to share what he had gathered. She hoped, without knowing why, that he had not been entirely unhappy. That somewhere in the 38 years of silence in those 4,000 square feet, there had been moments when the weight of the beautiful things he had collected had felt like company rather than burden. She went back inside. She went back down to the room. She sat on the floor with her back against the central table and her headlamp on, and she looked at the walls around her for a long time, unhurriedly, with the particular attention of someone who understands that they are in the presence of something that will never be this unknown again, and that the unknown is its own kind of treasure. Ruth Hadley arrived at 412 Dunore Lane 4 days later, which was the fastest arrangement Denise could manage, and the longest 4 days of Clara's recent memory. In the interim, Clara had done several things. She had turned off the pump and returned the rental equipment, the bill larger than she had budgeted for, and paid out of money she had set aside for the following month's utilities. She had resecured the damaged basement door with a wooden bar braced across it from the inside, which was not a sophisticated security measure, but was the best she could manage. She had told no one else. Not the children. Not Marcus. Not Gerald Pruitt, who had slipped another note under her door about a leak in the upstairs hallway that she was no longer sure was her problem. She had gone back to work at the school cafeteria and counted chicken nuggets into trays and smiled at children who did not see her, and driven home in the evenings and sat at her kitchen table and stared at the 47 photographs on her phone with a feeling she could not categorize. It was not simple happiness. It was not relief, or not only relief. It was something more complicated, something that included a strand of fear and a strand of grief and a strand of something that felt uncomfortably like anger at no one in particular. Anger at the years of careful mathematics and worn-out shoes and notes slipped under doors. Anger at the weight she had been carrying and how long she had been carrying it. She was aware that she did not yet know what the room was worth. She was aware that it was possible to have 47 photographs of wooden crates and canvas rolls and cloth-covered frames, and for all of it to turn out to be the careful organization of things that had some modest value, but not the value she was cautiously, terrifyingly allowing herself to imagine. She was aware that she had learned to manage hope the way you manage a flame in the wind, cupped in both hands, tilted away from the gusts. But she kept looking at the photographs, and she kept thinking about the label on the first crate. U.S. 1847 Double Eagle, 12 units. She had spent 2 evenings on her laptop after the children were in bed, reading everything she could find about mid-19th century American gold coinage. The 1849 Double Eagle was famous, the first year of issue, the single known specimen owned by the Smithsonian. But the 1847 was less celebrated, but no less valuable in the right grades, in the right quantity, from the right source. An 1847 Liberty Head Double Eagle in MS 63 condition, she learned, could realize between $40,000 and $70,000 at auction, depending on provenance, eye appeal, and current market conditions. 12 of them, properly authenticated, would be worth between $500,000 and $800,000 for a single crate, one of 20. She had closed the laptop after reading that and sat in the dark for a while. Ruth Hadley was a small woman in her early 60s, with short silver hair and a directness in her manner that Clara found immediately reassuring. She shook Clara's hand on the porch with the firm grip of someone who did not waste energy on performance, and looked at the house's exterior with an expression that was clinical rather than dismissive. She had brought with her a younger woman, introduced as a graduate student named Priya, who carried a canvas bag of equipment and a small digital camera, and who looked at the house with unguarded fascination. They went downstairs. Ruth Hadley stood in the doorway of the sealed room for approximately 15 seconds without moving. Then she stepped inside and went directly to the canvas rolls on the shelf and crouched before them with a small pen light she took from her breast pocket. She looked at the roll at the end of the row, examining the way the canvas had been rolled and the quality of the twine holding it, touching neither. She moved to the wooden crates and looked at the labeling with her pen light. She read the closest label and then the one beside it, and then she stood straight and turned to look at Clara. "Where did you say you got this property?" she asked. "Tax auction," Clara said. 2 weeks ago. For $10. Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "To Priya," rather than to Clara, and with the contained urgency of someone who is being very careful not to alarm an animal she is trying to approach, "Set up the camera, and call David before you do anything else." David, it emerged over the following 2 hours, was Dr. David Kowalski, a numismatist and material culture specialist at the University in Columbus, who had spent 30 years authenticating American coinage and whose professional connections extended to every major auction house in the country. He arrived the following morning in a car that smelled of coffee and old books, carrying 2 aluminum cases of equipment and an expression of the careful neutrality of a man who had seen enough surprising things in basements to have learned not to react until he had data. He opened the first crate. Clara stood at the doorway and watched him work. He used a jeweler's loupe and a pair of cotton gloves and a portable UV lamp, and he worked slowly, examining each coin in the crate with the attention of a person for whom time is irrelevant when precision is required. He did not speak for 20 minutes, but Clara watched his face for information, and his face gave her none. Ruth stood behind her in the doorway with her arms folded. After 20 minutes, David set down the loupe and sat back on his heels and looked at the coin he was holding up to the lamp for what might have been the 3rd time. He turned it. He turned it again. He set it gently back in its housing in the crate's velvet-lined interior and picked up the next one. After 40 minutes, he closed the crate. He turned around and looked at Clara and said, in a voice that was so deliberately even that the evenness itself was informative, "Where did the county say this man got his money?" "He was described as a private collector," Clara said. "He made a donation to the Historical Society once. They called it significant." David nodded slowly. He looked at the crate. He looked at the room. And he said, "I need to see the ledger, and I need to see what's on the back wall." They opened the ledger together, David and Ruth, with Priya documenting from behind. The ledger was organized chronologically, entries beginning in 1952 and running through 1988, the year before Edmund Hargrove died. Each entry recorded an acquisition, a date, a description, a condition notation, a provenance note where one existed, and a figure that appeared to represent what Hargrove had paid. The figures in the early entries were modest, the careful outlays of a man who knew what he was buying when others did not. A small number of gold coins acquired at an estate sale in Cincinnati for $40 in 1952. A set of pre-Civil War double eagles purchased privately in 1956 for $300. Canvas rolls listed in 1961, described only by dimensions and a notation that read, attributed, post-impressionist school, unsigned, Paris acquisition. And on, page after careful page, 36 years of deliberate acquisition, each entry in the same steady hand, each one reflecting a man who had spent decades buying things that other people did not yet understand. They were selling. David turned to the back wall and began lifting the protective cloths from the paintings one by one, starting at the left, folding each cloth back with careful hands, and holding his lamp to the surface that was revealed. The first was a small oil, figures in a landscape, worked in the loose, confident manner she had glimpsed briefly before. The second was larger, an interior scene, a woman at a table, said the light falling across her hands in a way that was so precisely observed it felt almost like an intrusion. The third was a seascape, dark and thick with paint, the kind of surface that absorbed light rather than reflected it. At the sixth painting, David stopped. He did not move for a very long time. He looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at the painting. She unfolded her arms and came closer and stood beside David and looked at the painting with the focused stillness of someone reading something they have to read twice before they trust what it says. She looked at the lower right corner of the canvas. She looked at the brushwork in the upper left quadrant. She looked at the particular quality of the crocolure across the paint surface, the way the fine network of age cracks mapped the picture plane. She said quietly, to no one in particular, the provenance notation in the ledger. 1961. Paris acquisition. Post-impressionist school. David said, still looking at the painting. I know. Clara said, what is it? Ruth turned around. She looked at Clara in the doorway. She looked at her with an expression that Clara recognized from the way people looked at her when they were trying to figure out how much to say. An expression that meant the information was large, and the speaker was uncertain the listener was ready for it. We need to do more research, Ruth said carefully. Before anyone says anything specific, we need to do more research, and we need to contact the right people. But I want to tell you something honestly. In 30 years of looking at paintings and working in this field, I have stood in front of a small number of works that had a particular quality. A quality that is very difficult to describe and very easy to recognize. She paused. She looked back at the painting. Then she looked at Clara. 2 of those works are hanging in the Louvre right now. One of them is in the Met. One is in a private collection in Switzerland that nobody outside the field knows exists. Clara heard the words. She processed them in the way you process information that is too large for the ordinary containers of thought, fitting it in stages, one piece at a time. And this one? She asked. Is still in a basement in Millhaven, Ohio, Ruth said, for now. The days that followed had a quality of unreality that Clara navigated as best she could from the outside, while continuing to live her ordinary life on the inside. She went to work at the elementary school. She ladled soup and sliced pizza. She drove to her office cleaning jobs 3 evenings a week. She made Lily's lunch and helped Noah with his reading exercises, and sat through the bath time ritual and put them to bed, and washed the dishes, and stood at the kitchen window in the dark. She performed all of the ordinary operations of her ordinary days with the particular surrealism of someone carrying a secret too large for the room they are standing in. She told no one knew. She did not tell Marcus. She did not tell anyone at work. When Tom Belcher waved to her from his car on Route 9, she waved back and drove past, and did not stop. David Kowalski worked fast. He had a network of specialists that operated, Clara quickly understood, somewhat like a relay race, each person carrying the question further than the last could go. He made calls to colleagues in New York and Chicago and London. He sent the photographs Priya had taken to 3 separate authentication consultants. He obtained a digitized copy of Edmund Hargrove's auction house records from the 1950s and 1960s through a contact at a research institution in Cincinnati. He found Hargrove's name in the catalog of an estate liquidation in 1958 in Paris, purchasing 4 lots described as miscellaneous artwork, post-impressionist period, from a family who had emigrated from France and needed to sell quickly what they could not carry. He called Clara on a Thursday evening while she was standing at the kitchen sink. "I have a preliminary figure," he said, "and I want to be clear that it's preliminary and that proper auction processes and full provenance research will affect the final number substantially in either direction. But based on what we've documented so far, I want you to have a number to hold." Clara dried her hands on the dish towel. She leaned against the counter. She said, "Tell me." "There are 19 authenticated crates of mid-19th century American gold coinage in various grades and series," David said. "Current market auction estimates for the verified specimens, based on comparable sales in the last 3 years, range from $3 million to $4.8 million for the coin collection alone. There are 11 canvas rolls, 9 of which contain authenticated works on paper, drawings and studies in the post-impressionist tradition with documented provenance, traceable to 3 separate Parisian collections. Those represent an estimated additional 1.2 to 2 million at current market. There are 7 locked wooden boxes, which we have not yet opened, pending your authorization and proper documentation procedures. Based on the ledger notations describing their contents, which reference specific stamps and currency series, we believe the boxes may contain philatelic and currency collections with significant numismatic value." Clara said nothing. "And the paintings," David said, and here his voice changed slightly, becoming the voice of a man choosing his words with particular care. "Of the 12 paintings in the back room, 4 have been preliminarily authenticated as significant works with auction house interest already expressed from 2 institutions I contacted this week. One of those 4 is the painting Ruth and I discussed when we first examined the room. I'm going to be careful about what I say about it, because we are still waiting on final authentication reports. But I want you to understand that the interest being expressed is not the interest people express when they think something might be nice. It is the interest people express when they think something is important." Clara was still leaning against the counter. Noah was in the next room watching his allotted 20 minutes of television before bed. Lily was reading in the room they shared. The refrigerator hummed. The clock on the microwave read 8:42. David said, I can give you a conservative combined preliminary figure for everything we have documented so far, excluding the locked boxes and the most significant painting pending final authentication." "Yes," Clara said. "Tell me." $31 million, David said, conservatively. "And there is a credible possibility, depending on the authentication results for the principal painting, that the final figure could be substantially higher." Clara's hand was flat on the counter. She pressed it there. She felt the cold of the laminate through her palm. She could hear Noah laughing at something on the television in the next room. The pure, uncomplicated sound of a 5-year-old who did not know that his mother was standing in the kitchen with her hand pressed flat on the counter and $31 million in her ears. She said, "Thank you, David." She said she would call him tomorrow. She hung up. She stood at the counter and did not move for a long time. Then she turned around and walked to the doorway of the living room and leaned against the frame and watched Noah watching television, his small body curled in the corner of the couch, his face lit by the screen, his feet tucked up underneath him the way he always sat. He looked small in the room. He looked the size of all the things she had been afraid of losing. She went to the wall above the couch. She looked at the 3 photographs. Her mother, Lily in the pumpkin patch, Noah at Christmas. She stood and looked at them for a long time. Then she went and sat beside her son on the couch and put her arm around him, and he leaned into her without taking his eyes off the screen, and she held him there, very still, in the ordinary kitchen light of their ordinary apartment on Turnpike Road. And she allowed herself, for the first time in 3 years, to feel something that was not maintenance and not management, and not the careful cupping of a flame in the wind. She allowed herself to feel hope, full and unguarded and warm, the way it feels before you have learned that the world will try to take it from you, the way it feels when you are 8 years old in a pumpkin patch with your arms stretched wide, like something that belongs to you, like something no one can calculate away. The authentication report arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after David Kowalski had first stood in Edmund Hargrove's sealed room and gone very still in front of the 6th painting on the back wall. Clara was at work when he called, and standing in the cafeteria kitchen with a hairnet on and a ladle in her hand, the lunch rush 20 minutes away. She saw his name on her phone screen and set the ladle down and stepped through the back door into the narrow corridor between the kitchen and the loading dock and answered it. David did not open with pleasantries. She had come to understand this was simply his manner, the economy of a man who spent his professional life measuring things precisely and had extended that precision to language as well. He said the final authentication report came back this morning from the 2nd independent lab. It confirms the first lab's findings. He said, the principal painting has been authenticated with high confidence as a work by Edouard Vuillard, completed approximately between 1905 and 1910, during his late intimiste period. The provenance has been traced through 3 documented ownership chains prior to its disappearance from the Paris market in 1941. It is not listed on any stolen art registry. The family who sold it at the 1958 estate liquidation had legal title, which means Edmund Hargrove purchased it legitimately, and you inherited it legitimately through the tax auction. Clara leaned against the corridor wall. She could hear the cafeteria on the other side of the kitchen door, the distant percussion of trays and voices, and the industrial hum of the warming units. She said, "What does that mean for the value?" "It means," David said, "that Christie's in New York has already made a formal inquiry. So has a private collector in Geneva, through an intermediary I've worked with before. The low estimate for the Vuillard alone, so based on comparable auction results for works of this period and this provenance profile, is $14 million. The high estimate, if the right buyers are in the room on the right day, is closer to 22. Clara pressed her back flat against the wall. The corridor was cold and smelled of bleach and old cardboard. A forklift hummed somewhere outside the loading dock doors. She said nothing. David continued. "The complete collection," he said, "including the authenticated coins, the works on paper, the philatelic and currency contents of the 7 boxes, which we have now fully documented, and all 12 paintings, represents a total authenticated value of between $67 and $89 million at current market." He paused. "That is not a speculative number. That is based on documented comparable sales, on current buyer interest already expressed, and conservative grading across all categories." Clara closed her eyes. She stood in the corridor of Millhaven Elementary School, in a hairnet, with a ladle drying on the kitchen counter behind her, and $67 million in the space behind her eyelids, and she breathed, in and out. Once, twice. She said, "Thank you, David." She said she would call him that evening. She hung up. She put the phone in her apron pocket. She stood in the corridor for another minute. Then she went back into the kitchen, picked up the ladle, and served lunch. She did not tell Denise that evening. She called her, because she had promised she would, and she said the final authentication was complete, and the results were positive, and she would explain everything when they could sit down together in person. Denise said, "How positive," Clara said. "Very." Denise said nothing for 3 seconds, and then said, "I'll come tomorrow," Clara said. "Bring Phil if you want. It might be useful to have Phil." She told Marcus the following Saturday when he arrived to pick up the children. She asked him to come inside for a moment, which was unusual enough that he looked at her carefully before stepping through the door. She sat him down at the kitchen table and told him, in the plain sequential manner she used when she wanted there to be no misunderstanding, what she had found, what it had been authenticated as, and what it was worth. She put David Kowalski's preliminary report on the table in front of him, the one with the letterhead and the figures and the itemized list. Marcus read it twice. Then he looked up at her. He said, "Clara." She said, "I know." He looked back at the report. He said, "You paid $10. She said, $9.47 in back taxes plus 53 cents rounding, plus the pump rental and the equipment, and Denise's $200, which I've already paid back." Marcus set the report down. He had the expression of a man trying to locate a fixed point in a landscape that has just shifted dramatically. He said, "Are the kids going to be okay?" Clara looked at him. She felt, in that moment, no particular anger. What she felt was closer to a tired clarity, the kind that comes at the end of a very long effort. She said, "The kids are going to be more than okay. That's the whole point." The news moved through Millhaven the way news always moved through small towns, which is to say, quickly and imperfectly, and attached to a quantity of embellishment that grew in direct proportion to the distance from the source. She did not announce it. She had no intention of announcing it. But David Kowalski had colleagues who spoke to other colleagues, and one of those conversations found its way to a reporter at a regional Ohio newspaper who called Clara's number on a Thursday morning and asked if she would like to comment on the reported discovery of a significant art and numismatic collection in a Millhaven property she had acquired at auction. Clara said she had no comment at this time. The reporter published a brief item the following Monday anyway, sourced anonymously, describing the general outlines of what had been found. The item was short and careful and got several details wrong, but it had enough truth in it to do what truth in small quantities always does in small towns. It spread. By the following Wednesday, Clara had received 4 phone calls from people she barely knew, expressing congratulations, with a warmth that was inversely proportional to how much interest they had shown in her previously. She received a handwritten note from a woman she had gone to school with, who had not spoken to her in 11 years, which expressed how she had always admired Clara's determination and perseverance, a sentiment Clara was fairly certain had not been expressed or felt in the preceding 11 years. She received an email from Gerald Pruitt, suggesting that given her recently changed circumstances, perhaps they could discuss a revised lease arrangement going forward, an email she read twice, set aside, and did not answer. Tom Belcher called her on a Friday afternoon. She recognized the number and almost did not pick up, and then picked up because she had decided, somewhere in the weeks since standing in that sealed room with her hand against the central table, that there was no version of this that she needed to avoid. She had earned the right to pick up the phone. He said her name and then said he had heard about what had happened at the Hargrove place, and that it was, well, it was really something. He said, "I have to admit I didn't think, when I saw you at the gas station, I didn't think the property had much to offer." Clara said, "I know." He said, "I guess that just goes to show you." Clara said, "I suppose it does, Tom." He seemed to expect something more from her, some elaboration of the lesson, some acknowledgement of the distance between his assessment and the reality, some version of the conversation that allowed him to feel he had participated in the story. Clara did not give it to him. She said she had another call coming in, which was true, and she said goodbye and hung up. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter and more complete than triumph. She felt correct. Not in the sense of having been right over someone else's wrong, but in the deeper sense of having been aligned with something true when other people were not, and of having followed that alignment when it was costly rather than convenient. Denise came to Dunore Lane on the first warm Saturday of April, or 3 weeks after the authentication was complete, and 4 days after Clara had accepted David Kowalski's recommendation and signed a representation agreement with a specialist firm in New York that would handle the collection's sale and dispersal. Clara had the key to the front door now, a proper key cut by a locksmith she had hired, and she opened the house and led her sister through the front hall with its hexagonal tile and its carved staircase and its dust and its particular quality of old light. Denise walked through every room. She walked slowly, the way Clara had walked the first day, touching nothing, looking at everything. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the overgrown yard. She climbed the stairs to the second floor and the third floor and stood on the widow's walk with the wind in her hair and looked out over Millhaven below. She said nothing for a long time. Then she came back down, and they stood together in the front hall, and Denise looked at her sister, and Clara looked at her sister. And what passed between them did not need words. It had the texture of everything they had grown up carrying together, everything they had managed and rationed and made do with, every conversation where the subtext was, "We are okay. but only if nothing else goes wrong. Denise's eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, with something that had the same source as tears, but was being rerouted into something more useful. She said, "You're going to fix this house." Clara said, "That's what I'm thinking." Fix it and live in it. Clara looked up the staircase, at the carved banister, the sweep of it, the way it curved at the bottom with the grace of a century ago. She thought about Lily running up those stairs. She thought about Noah, who was afraid of thunderstorms, lying in a bedroom with a ceiling twice the height of the one on Turnpike Road, listening to thunder roll across the open fields and feeling safe. She said, "It'll take time. There's a lot of work. But yes, live in it." Denise was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the voice of a woman making a confession, "You know, when you first told me about the auction, when you said you wanted to bid $10 on a flooded, condemned house at the edge of town, I thought you had finally broken. I thought the last 3 years had finally done it." "I know," Clara said. "I'm sorry I said what I said about the rope." "You weren't wrong to be worried," Clara said. "You were just working with the information you had." Denise looked at her. She said, "How are you so calm about all of this?" Clara thought about it. She said, "I spent 3 years getting very good at being the only person in the room who believed things were going to be okay." She paused. "I guess I just kept practicing, even when I wasn't sure it was true." Denise made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She put her arms around her sister and held her in the front hallway of the house that was going to be theirs, among the dust and the particular old light, and Clara held her back. It was during the final cataloging process, when the specialist firm sent their own team to document and remove the collection for transport to New York, that the last discovery was made. And Clara was present for the process, seated in the central room with a clipboard and the copy of Edmund Hargrove's ledger that David had photographed and transcribed. The specialists worked methodically and carefully, more carefully than Clara had worked with the pry bar, which she privately appreciated. They moved each crate, each canvas roll, each wooden box through a systematic documentation process, photographing, tagging, logging. When they lifted the wooden table from the center of the room to move it clear for access to the back wall, one of the specialists, a woman named Greta, with the careful hands of a surgeon, said quietly that there was something affixed to the underside of the table. Clara came and looked. Taped to the underside of the central table's top, in a sealed plastic sleeve that had kept it dry and intact, it was an envelope. Old cream-colored stationery, heavy stock, the kind of envelope that suggests both quality and intention. On the front, in the same steady hand that had filled the ledger for 36 years, was written a single word: "To whoever finds this." Clara took the envelope. She turned it over. The seal was intact. She looked at it for a moment, and then she carried it upstairs to the first floor and sat down on the bottom step of the staircase and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. The handwriting was the same as the ledger, precise and unhurried. The letter was dated October 1988, a year before Edmund Hargrove died. It read, "I do not know who you are. I do not know what year it is as you read this, or how long the basement held its water, or what the world looks like now from the widow's walk above. And I have been a private man by disposition and circumstance alike, and privacy has served me well in most respects, though I have sometimes suspected it cost me more than I understood while I was paying for it. I began collecting in 1952 when I was 31 years old, and had just come back from a war that had taken most of what I thought I was. I found that beautiful things, properly understood and properly cared for, did not lie to you. They did not leave. They did not require anything from you except attention, and in return, they gave you back a version of the world that was worth inhabiting. I was not a generous man with people. I was generous only with objects. This was a failing. I understand it now better than I did while I was living it. I built the room, and I built the wall, because I did not trust what would happen to these things after I was gone. I had no family to leave them to. I did not trust institutions. I had a lawyer once, but we disagreed about the nature of things. The water was an accident. I had known the drainage was failing, but I was old, and the repairs were expensive, and I suppose I thought it didn't matter anymore. By the time I understood that the basement would flood, the room was already sealed, and it seemed perhaps better that way. Better sealed and submerged than exposed to the particular carelessness of the world. I have thought in the years since I built the room that it was the wrong decision, not to collect and not to preserve, but to do both in secrecy. Beautiful things belong in the light. The pleasure of them is diminished by solitude. I kept them to myself because I was afraid of what sharing them would cost me, and I think now that the cost of not sharing was higher than I calculated. I do not know you, but you found the room, which means you found the house, which means something brought you here that I cannot account for. I hope it was not desperation. I hope it was curiosity, or the particular kind of stubbornness that does not accept that a story is finished simply because everyone else has stopped reading it. Whatever brought you, the room is yours now. Everything in it is yours. I ask only one thing, not as a condition. I have no power to impose conditions from wherever I am as you read this, but as a request, from one person who loved these things to another who has just discovered them. Find the We Are a home where people can see it. It was never meant to hang in a basement. None of them were. Take care of the house. It was built well, and it deserved better than I gave it in the end. The widow's walk especially. On clear days, you can see all the way to the county line. I hope you are all right. I hope whatever brought you here brought you somewhere better afterward. Edmund Hargrove. Clara sat on the bottom step of the staircase for a long time after she finished reading. The specialists moved quietly in the basement below her. Light came through the front windows in long afternoon slabs, the April light that is the warmest Ohio gets before summer, cutting across the hexagonal tile of the foyer and reaching the base of the staircase and resting there. The house was warm today for the first time since she had known it, though the month had turned and the cold had softened, and Dunore Lane was greening up along the property line, where the wild grass was beginning to grow back with the particular ambition of spring. She read the letter again. She read the line about beautiful things belonging in the light, and she thought about a man who had spent 38 years keeping beautiful things in the dark, and had understood at the end, or near the end, that this had been a failure of a particular kind. Not a moral failure, or not only that, a failure of courage. The courage to share what you love, which requires trusting that the world will not take it from you, or diminish it, or use it as evidence against you. She thought about the 3 years she had spent cupping her own hope in both hands, tilting it away from the gusts, protecting it from being seen by anyone who might extinguish it. She understood something in Edmund Hargrove's letter that she could not have understood before the basement room and the sealed wall, and the black water that had been asked to serve as a guardian for 30 years. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in its envelope. She would show it to Ruth Hadley and to David Kowalski because they had earned the right to read it, and she would keep the original in the fireproof box she would buy for the new house. She would read it again on days when things were hard, which there would still be, because there are always days when things are hard, regardless of the contents of basement rooms. Because hard days are not a poverty problem, they are a living problem. So when no sum of money in the world has ever fully resolved the problem of being alive. The Vuillard sold at Christie's in New York on a Thursday in June, 14 weeks after the authentication was complete. Clara did not attend the auction in person. She sat at the kitchen table of the apartment on Turnpike Road, which she was still living in because the renovation of the house at 412 Dunore Lane was underway, but not complete, and she watched the live auction feed on her laptop with Denise beside her, and both children doing homework at the other end of the table, unaware of what the numbers on the screen meant in any practical sense. Lily looked up once when Denise made a sound and said, "What happened?" Denise said, "Your mom's painting just sold." Lily said, "For how much?" Clara turned the laptop so Lily could see the screen. Lily looked at the number. She said, "Mom, is that real?" Clara said it was. Lily looked at it for another moment and then said, very calmly, the way 8-year-olds sometimes process enormous information with more grace than adults. "Okay," and went back to her homework. The Vuillard sold for $18.4 million. The buyer was a museum foundation whose name Clara did not recognize until David explained its connection to a larger institution on the East Coast where the painting would be part of a permanent collection, accessible to anyone who came through the doors. She thought of Edmund Hargrove's letter. She thought of the line about it never being meant to hang in a basement. She felt, on behalf of a man she had never met and never would meet, on something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite grief, but lived in the territory between them, the way good endings sometimes do when they arrive too late for everyone who deserved to see them. The full collection realized $63 million through a dispersal process that took 8 months. Some pieces went to auction. Some went to private collectors through the specialist firm's network. Several of the works on paper were acquired by a university collection. The coins were dispersed across 3 major numismatic auctions in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, attracting the quiet, intense attention of collectors who understood what it meant when 19 crates of mid-19th century American gold coinage appeared on the market simultaneously, well documented, well preserved, and traced to a single private collection assembled in the 1950s and 1960s by a man who had known precisely what he was buying when others did not. $63 million. From a house she had bought for $10 and a flooded basement that everyone in the room had already decided held nothing worth finding. She paid her debt to Denise first, not the $200 that had long since been repaid. She paid a different kind of debt, the one that cannot be itemized or calculated, the one that accumulates over years of being caught by someone who asked nothing in return. She purchased the house 2 streets over that Denise had rented for 11 years and transferred its title to her sister's name on a Tuesday afternoon at a title company's office. And Denise sat across the table from her with Phil beside her and did not cry, which was entirely consistent with who Denise was, but held Clara's hand across the table for a long moment before letting go She established a college fund for Lily and one for Noah, each one sufficient to cover any institution, any program, any direction either of them decided their life was meant to go. She established a small scholarship at Millhaven Elementary in her mother's name, targeted at children qualifying for the subsidized lunch program, because she understood in a way that was not abstract what it meant to be a child. In a cafeteria line whose lunch was a calculation rather than a given. She hired the contractor Denise recommended, a careful and meticulous man named Arturo, who had spent 30 years restoring older structures and who walked through the house at 412 Dunore Lane on his first visit with the expression of a person encountering something they recognize as worthy of their best work. The renovation took 11 months. The basement was waterproofed and the drainage rebuilt, and the flooring relaid in stone that matched the original. The walls were replastered and repainted. The porch was rebuilt board by board, the railings restored to their original design using photographs Clara found in the County Historical Society's archive. The roof was replaced. The windows were reglazed. The widow's walk was repaired and reinforced, its railing restored, its floor relaid in cedar. The kitchen was made warm and functional without being made unrecognizable. Clara kept the hexagonal tile in the foyer because it had survived everything and deserved to stay. She kept the built-in bookshelves on the third floor and filled them. She kept the carved banister because it had been built by someone who cared about the hand that would run along it, and that mattered to her in a way she could not entirely explain. She moved in on a Saturday in early April, exactly 1 year after the day she had first opened the basement door and smelled the particular mineral cold of 30 years of standing water. The moving truck held what they had, which was not very much, and what they had fit easily into a house of 4,000 square feet, which meant that the rooms were sparsely furnished at first, echoing slightly when the children ran through them. Noah ran through most of them within the first 20 minutes of arrival, testing their resonance, reporting back on which rooms were the loudest. He had not outgrown his fear of thunderstorms, but on the first night they slept in the house, a storm rolled through. And he came to Clara's room, and she held him, and they listened to it together. And in the morning he said it had sounded different in this house. Better, he said, less scary, like it was further away even when it wasn't. Lily claimed the third-floor room with the bookshelves. Clara had expected this. Lily had decided on the third floor before she had seen the full house, having been informed that there was a door that opened onto a widow's walk. And she was 8 years old, and already the kind of person who needed height and perspective and distance from the ordinary level of things. Clara recognized this in her. She recognized it the way you recognize something in a child that you know from your own chest. On a Tuesday evening in May, when the house had been theirs for 6 weeks, and the contractor had finished his final walkthrough, and the renovation was complete, Clara climbed to the widow's walk alone at dusk. She brought nothing with her. She stood at the railing and looked out over Dunore Lane and the tree line and Millhaven below. The town spread in its ordinary way across the low hills, the diner's neon sign flickering as it always did, the park fountain visible from this height as a small silver disk catching the last of the light. Edmund Hargrove had stood here, many evenings, probably, in the 38 years he had lived in this house. He had looked at the same town from the same height. He had known something about solitude that Clara was still learning. The difference between the solitude that protects and the solitude that diminishes. She thought she was beginning to understand the difference. She hoped he had too, before the end. The sky above Millhaven was doing something she recognized from the description in an old letter. The colors that exist for only a few minutes before the day burns them away. She stood in them and let them rest on her face. She thought about what she had been the morning she first saw the listing on the county records website. She thought about the woman at the kitchen table in the apartment on Turnpike Road at 11:47 at night, with a cup of cold coffee and a second-hand laptop and a stack of papers in a drawer she could not bring herself to open. She thought about that woman, and she felt for her the particular tenderness you feel for a version of yourself you can no longer reach, a version that was doing the best it could with what it had, and deserved more than it was getting. She thought about what it meant that she had looked at a listing for a flooded condemned building and had not turned the page. She had not turned the page because she was desperate enough to look at things others had decided were not worth looking at. And that desperation, which she had always understood as a weakness, had turned out to be the most important thing about her. The willingness to see possibility in what others had dismissed. The refusal to accept that a story was finished simply because everyone else had stopped reading it. Edmund Hargrove had written that line, and she had read it sitting on the bottom stair of the house she now lived in. And she had not been sure at the time whether it applied to her or whether she was reading herself into it. Now she thought it did apply, not because she had been stubborn or reckless or lucky, though she had been some of all of those things, but because she had understood, in the way that people who have been truly close to losing something understand it, that the things most worth finding are always on the other side of the decision that everyone else decided not to make. She looked out at the county line, just visible from here on a clear day, odd as Edmund had written. He had been right about that. She had checked on the first clear morning after moving in, pressing her hands on the railing and looking out as far as the eye would carry. The county line was there, faint and precise, a boundary she had not crossed in years and now had no particular reason to. Everything she needed was here. Everything she needed had always been here, buried under the water, waiting for someone to decide it was worth the pump rental and the pry bar and the $10 and the faith required to stand in a flooded basement in the dark and believe that the silence was full rather than empty. She stayed on the widow's walk until the colors left the sky. Then she went downstairs. Noah was in the kitchen asking Denise, who had come for dinner, whether grilled cheese counted as a real meal. Lily was on the staircase reading, her back against the banister, her feet on the step below, a book open across her knees, entirely absorbed. Clara paused at the bottom of the stairs and looked at her daughter and thought, for no particular reason she could name, except that the moment invited it, that Lily was going to be extraordinary. Not because of the money, not because of the house, not because anything external had changed about who Lily was or what she was capable of, but because she had watched her mother refuse to stop believing in the unseeable, and she had taken that in the way children take in the most important things, quietly, deeply, permanently. She passed Lily on the stairs, and Lily did not look up from her book, which was exactly right. She went into the kitchen and washed her hands at the sink and stood beside Denise and said that grilled cheese absolutely counted as a real meal and probably always would. Noah cheered. Denise handed her the spatula. The kitchen smelled of warm bread and butter, and outside the window, the yard was dark, and the oaks were large against the sky, and inside the house, There was light in every room that had once held only years of waiting and shadow. This is the story of a woman who bought a flooded basement for $10 and found inside it not just a fortune, but a confirmation. A confirmation that the things most worth having are the ones you were willing to look for when no one else was looking. That the rooms sealed off by other people's fear or neglect or despair are sometimes sealed around the very thing you needed most. So that the water that looks like an ending is sometimes simply a covering, patient and temporary, holding something safe until the right person arrives with a pump and a pry bar and enough stubbornness to drain it down to the truth. Clara Merritt had paid $10 for a house that everyone in the room had already dismissed. She had borrowed money from her sister and rented a pump and descended into the dark. She had stood in a flooded basement with her phone light on the surface of the water and felt the silence pressing against her eardrums and chosen to believe the silence was full rather than empty. And she had been right. Not because she was lucky, though the alignment of things had required some luck, but because she was the kind of person who looks at a condemned door and does not accept the condemnation without checking what is on the other side. Edmund Hargrove had left his letter for whoever finds this. He had hoped it was not desperation. He had hoped it was curiosity or stubbornness. He had gotten both. He had gotten a woman on the edge of losing everything who had looked at a flooded basement at the bottom of a condemned Victorian house at the edge of a small Ohio town, and thought, not what everyone else thought, which was nothing worth saving here, but rather the opposite, quietly, practically, with the particular courage of someone who has nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing left to fear. Something brought her here. Let me find out what it is. She found out. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.